In all my years at the palace, I only ever knew one man the king trusted completely, and everyone knew it. When the king needed the truth, he asked that man. When the king could not sleep, that man was often the one who stayed. For decades, the two of them were never far apart. The king and his most senior advisor, two old men who had grown gray in each other's company. I used to think that bond was simply part of the furniture, as permanent as the walls themselves. And then one gray Monday, a short notice went up on the household board, 3 lines long, saying that the man was leaving. No reason, no warning. And I knew, before anyone said a single word, that the whole country was about to lose its mind guessing why. The man was the king's most senior advisor, and the king was Charles. A private secretary, in plain words, is the most senior aide to the monarch, the person who manages the sovereign's business and stands closer to him than almost anyone in the whole household. And this one had stood beside Charles for decades, through his long years as heir and into his reign. His sudden departure, announced in 3 cold lines with no explanation at all, was exactly the kind of development that sets an entire nation talking. Within hours, the speculation had begun. A falling out, a power struggle, a palace in chaos, a king quietly losing his grip. The theories grew wilder by the day, and the pressure on Charles to explain grew wilder along with them. But the king said nothing, and then Charles did the hardest thing a man in his position can do. He chose to stay silent and let them think the worst. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you do not miss a single update. The silence was unbearable to almost everyone but Charles. Speculation, in plain words, is guessing and rumor about something that has not been explained, and it rushes in to fill any silence where the facts are missing. And the palace had left an enormous silence. A trusted advisor of decades does not simply vanish from a monarch's side without a reason, everyone agreed, and so the country set about inventing one. Some said the two men had quarreled bitterly. Some said there had been a scandal, quietly buried. Some said the king was isolated, difficult, losing the loyalty of those around him. None of it was true. All of it spread like fire. Part of what fed the frenzy was the way such a departure normally works. A reshuffle, in plain words, is a planned change in who holds the senior jobs in an organization, and a proper reshuffle comes with careful explanation, warm words, a smooth handover, all designed to reassure. This had none of that. It was abrupt, cold, and wordless, and to the watching world, that could only mean one thing. People do not hide a happy parting. They hide a painful one, and so the very silence that was meant to protect a man's dignity looked, from the outside, exactly like the cover-up of a disaster. What the country did not understand was that the silence was itself an act of discretion. Discretion, in plain words, is the quiet judgment of knowing what should be kept private and having the strength to keep it, even under pressure. Charles was not hiding a scandal. He was exercising discretion of the rarest and most costly kind, holding a confidence that was hurting him, because breaking it would hurt someone else more. But discretion, by its nature, cannot explain itself. The whole point of it is that it stays quiet. And so the more honorably Charles behaved, the worse he was made to look. The press, in particular, treated the departure as proof of something rotten. Each day brought a new theory, dressed up as insight, about the turmoil that must surely lie behind such an abrupt goodbye. The court circular, in plain words, is the official daily record of the family's public duties, and commentators pored over it looking for signs of a king in trouble, a reign under strain, a household in disarray. They found what people always find when they go looking for a crisis. They found enough to keep the story alive, and never quite enough to end it. The reaction across the country hardened into a single anxious question. Ordinary people wondered aloud whether something was wrong with the king. Commentators competed to offer the darkest explanation. Loyal supporters of the crown grew quietly worried, and the palace, watching the story spiral, felt the ground shifting beneath a monarchy that had seemed, only weeks before, entirely secure. Inside the palace, the pressure on Charles became intense. According to a documented household account later shared with senior aides, the king's communications team grew increasingly desperate as the speculation worsened. A communications advisor, in plain words, is the aide whose job is to manage how the monarch appears in the press and to the public, and they could see the damage mounting by the hour. Every day the true reason went unspoken, the false reasons grew stronger. And so again and again they came to Charles with the same plea. Say something. Explain. Give the country a reason before the rumors become the truth. The most senior of them made the case bluntly. We have to give them a reason, sir, the advisor said, in one tense meeting after another. He argued that the monarchy could not afford to look leaderless, that the speculation was corroding public confidence, that a single honest explanation would end the whole ordeal in an afternoon, and he was not wrong about the danger. The pressure was real, the damage was real, and the simplest solution was right there, one true sentence away. All Charles had to do was explain why his advisor had left, and the storm would break at once. But Charles would not say the words. And to understand why, you have to know what had happened in a quiet room some weeks before, when an old man came to his king with a difficult request. The advisor had not been dismissed, and there had been no falling out. According to a private palace briefing, the truth was the opposite of everything the country was imagining. The old man had come to Charles himself, of his own accord, and asked to be allowed to leave. He had served the crown for the whole of his working life, faithfully and brilliantly, and he had reached the point every long servant secretly dreads. His health had quietly begun to fail him, not dramatically, not visibly, not yet. But he could feel it, the small slips, the moments of confusion, the sense of a sharp mind beginning, at the edges, to blur. And he was terrified of one thing above all others. He was terrified of letting the king down. According to a recorded conversation kept by a senior aide, the old advisor sat with Charles and explained, with great difficulty, that he could no longer trust himself to do the job as it deserved to be done. He did not want to be the man who made a mistake at the worst possible moment, who forgot something vital, who failed his king after a lifetime of never failing him. He wanted to leave while he was still himself, while the record of his service was still unblemished, before anyone had cause to whisper that the old man was slipping. And then he made his request, the one that would cost Charles so dearly. "Let me leave before I let you down," the advisor said, and he asked that the real reason never be spoken aloud. He asked it for the simplest and most human of reasons. He did not want to be remembered for his decline. He had given 50 years of sharp, devoted service, and he wanted that to be the memory he left behind. Not a sad final chapter about a mind beginning to fade. He wanted to walk out of the palace with his dignity whole, to be thought of, for whatever years remained to him, as the man he had been, not the man he was becoming. And so he asked his king to protect him, not from disgrace, but from pity, to let the country wonder if it must, rather than let it know the tender truth. What he was really asking Charles to protect was his place in the memory of the household. The household, in plain words, is the whole body of people who serve the crown, and within it, reputation is everything. A great servant of the crown lives on, after they are gone, in the stories the household tells about them, the standard they set, the example they left. The old advisor had spent 50 years building that legacy, and he could not bear the thought of it ending with whispers about the day he began to slip. He was not asking for much. He was asking only to be remembered well. And to a man like Charles, who understood exactly what such a legacy meant, it was the most reasonable request in the world. Charles understood the request completely, because Charles understood the man completely. Here the story asks us to see what the king saw. He did not see an aide who had become inconvenient. He saw a friend of decades, a man who had given him his whole adult life sitting across from him and asking with quiet courage to be allowed to bow out with his head high. To Charles there was never any question of what loyalty required. The old man had protected the king for 50 years. Now it was the king's turn to protect him, and if protecting him meant absorbing weeks of ugly speculation, of whispers that Charles was failing, isolated, in trouble, then that was simply the price, and Charles would pay it without complaint. The moment settled something deep between the two old men. The advisor made his difficult request and waited, afraid of the answer. Charles listened and felt the full weight of 50 years pass between them. The years of service, of loyalty, of quiet friendship seemed to gather in that small room. And in the end, the king gave his answer not as a monarch to a servant, but as one old friend to another, with a simple promise that neither of them would ever need to mention again. That was the promise Charles made in that quiet room, and it was the promise that now held him silent while the storm raged. Every plea from his advisors to explain, every damaging headline, every wild theory about turmoil at the palace, all of it crashed against a single fact that none of them knew. The king had given his word. He had promised a loyal old friend that the truth would stay buried, and Charles was not a man who broke his word to spare himself discomfort. The pressure was enormous, the temptation was real, and Charles held. That was the promise Charles made in that quiet room, and it was the promise that now held him silent, while the storm raged. Every plea from his advisors to explain, every damaging headline, every wild theory about turmoil at the palace, all of it crashed against a single fact that none of them knew. The king had given his word. He had promised a loyal old friend that the truth would stay buried, and Charles was not a man who broke his word to spare himself discomfort. The pressure was enormous. The temptation was real, and Charles held. The strain of it showed, even if the reason did not. According to an internal note later circulated among private secretaries, those closest to the king watched him absorb weeks of unfair speculation without ever reaching for the easy way out, and some of them could not understand it. To them, the king seemed to be wounding himself for no reason, letting his reputation take blow after blow when a single sentence would have stopped it. They did not know about the promise. They only saw a monarch under siege, choosing, inexplicably, not to defend himself, and the not knowing made his silence seem to some like weakness. It was, in truth, the exact opposite. The reaction inside the household split along the line of who understood and who did not. Charles bore the pressure with a steady, quiet resolve. The communications advisor grew more frantic, unable to see the reason behind the silence. Anne, who had guessed at least part of the truth, watched her brother with quiet respect, and William, though he too did not know the whole story, trusted that his father had a reason and stood by him without demanding to know what it was. Then came the moment the pressure reached its peak. The speculation had grown so loud and the damage so real that the communications advisor made one final, forceful push. In a tense meeting, he laid out the full cost of the king's silence, the falling confidence, the mounting rumors, the harm being done to the monarchy itself, and he begged Charles one last time to explain. Surely, he argued, the stability of the crown mattered more than one retired man's privacy. Surely the king had to think of the institution first. And Charles, who had listened patiently to all of it, finally answered quietly and with total finality. The advisor's argument rested on the one thing a monarch is meant to hold above all else. The institution, in plain words, is the monarchy itself, the ancient office of the crown, which is supposed to matter more than any single person who serves it, including sometimes the very people the crown loves. It was a serious argument, made in good faith. The advisor truly believed that Charles was putting a friendship above the throne, and that no king had the right to do that. What the advisor did not understand was that Charles saw it exactly the other way around. To betray a loyal old friend to protect the crown's image would not have strengthened the institution. It would have hollowed it out, because an institution that discards its most faithful servants the moment they become inconvenient is not worth protecting at all. "He gave me his whole life," Charles said. "I can give him his silence." The room went still, because there was no arguing with it. The advisor had spoken of the institution, of confidence, of image and strategy and damage, and the king had answered with something simpler and far stronger than any of it: loyalty. A debt of honor owed to a man who had earned it 1,000 times over. Charles was not protecting a secret to be difficult, or out of stubbornness, or because he did not grasp the stakes. He was protecting a friend because that friend had asked him to, and because a promise is a promise even when keeping it costs you dearly. The advisor fell silent. He understood, at last, that the king's silence was not the absence of strength. It was strength itself, the kind that endures pain for someone else's sake and asks for nothing in return. The words changed the room, and changed the people in it. Charles delivered his answer and felt the weight of the promise settle, heavier and surer than ever. The communications advisor absorbed the rebuke and felt his own certainty crumble. The other aides present, who had also wished the king would explain, suddenly felt ashamed of having wished it, and in that quiet room, the whole argument about image and strategy simply dissolved, defeated by a single, unanswerable act of loyalty. And here the story turns, the way these stories do, away from self-defense. Because Charles had every means to clear his own name, and every reason to want to. He could have ended the speculation in a moment. He could have traded the old man's private truth for his own public relief, and almost no one would have blamed him for it. The pressure was crushing, and the solution was simple, and it sat within his reach every single day. Charles never touched it. He absorbed the damage to his own reputation, week after week, rather than spend a single ounce of a loyal friend's dignity to save himself. It was, quietly, one of the most honorable things a king could do, precisely because no one was supposed to ever know he had done it. According to a sealed account later described to senior staff, Charles did far more than simply stay silent. In the weeks that followed, the king quietly made sure the old advisor was cared for, that his retirement was comfortable and his final years free of worry, and that the household treated him to the very end with the honor his service had earned. None of it was announced. None of it was done for show. Charles simply looked after a man who had looked after him, in the same quiet way he had kept the man's secret, expecting nothing in return and making certain no one would ever know the trouble he had taken. It was loyalty carried through to the finish in private, where only the two of them would ever see it. The way the king bore it all left its mark on those around him. The aides who had doubted him came to admire him. The communications advisor, so certain before, became one of the quiet keepers of the secret he had once begged to break. Anne watched her brother with a pride she did not need to speak, and William, learning in time the true shape of what his father had done, understood that he had just been shown, without a single lecture, exactly what kind of king he hoped one day to be. But the truth, as it so often does, found its own quiet way into the light. Not through a statement, and not through any betrayal of the promise. The old advisor's failing health could not stay hidden forever, and in time, gently and without fanfare, those who knew him came to understand why he had really left. A word here, a kindness there, the quiet care the palace was seen to take of him in his retirement. Slowly, the shape of the truth became clear, and as it did, the whole ugly story of turmoil and chaos collapsed, and something quite different rose in its place. It mattered a great deal that Charles had never once tried to hurry that truth along. He could easily have let it slip. To brief the press in plain words is to quietly pass information to reporters without being named as the source, and any palace can arrange for an inconvenient truth to leak in a way that serves its own interests. It would have been the simplest thing in the world for Charles to let the real reason drift out through a well-placed whisper, clearing his own name while keeping his hands clean. He refused even that. He had promised silence, and he kept it completely, so that when the truth finally emerged, it emerged in its own time and its own gentle way, and never once because the king had chosen to save himself. Even his vindication he left to fate rather than take by his own hand. A major newspaper, catching the turn, ran the story under a very different kind of headline. "Why the King Stayed Silent," it read. A newspaper front page, in plain words, is the first thing millions of people see before they read a single word beneath it. And this one told a story not of a palace in crisis, but of a king who had quietly protected a dying loyalty at great cost to himself. The speculation that had painted Charles as weak and embattled began almost overnight to look foolish and cruel. The country had been shouting about chaos, and the truth had been quiet honor all along. A broadcaster summed up the reversal in a single line. "What looked like weakness," the broadcaster said, "was loyalty all along." That sentence captured the whole strange journey of the story. For weeks, the country had read Charles's silence as a sign of trouble, of a king losing his grip. Now they understood that the silence had been a choice, a hard and honorable one, made to shield an old man's dignity from a world that would have picked it apart. The very thing that had seemed to prove Charles weak turned out to be the clearest possible proof of his strength. The public sentiment shifted, slowly and then completely. People who had doubted the king found themselves quietly moved by what he had done. In an age when public figures rushed to explain themselves, to defend their image, to protect their standing at any cost, here was a man who had done the opposite. He had let himself be misjudged for weeks by an entire nation, rather than betray one old friend's request to be left in peace. It was an old-fashioned kind of honor, the kind people say no longer exists, and Charles had shown it not in a grand gesture, but in a long, painful, deliberate silence that no one was ever meant to understand. What moved people most, once they understood it, was how ordinary the loyalty was underneath the crown. Strip away the palace and the titles, and it was simply the story of one man keeping his word to another, of a friend protecting a friend's dignity at real cost to himself. Anyone who had ever loved an aging parent, or watched a proud person begin to fade, or been trusted with a secret they were tempted to tell, felt the truth of it at once. The king was not admired for being kingly, he was admired for being decent, in a way anyone could recognize and almost no one finds easy. And that, in the end, drew people closer to him than any triumph ever could have. The old advisor, for his part, lived out his retirement exactly as he had wished, remembered by the public not for any decline, but for a lifetime of devoted service and a quiet, dignified goodbye. The pity he had feared never came. The respect he had earned only deepened. And the king who had protected him never once mentioned the cost he had paid to do it, because to Charles, mentioning it would have defeated the entire purpose. Some kindnesses are only truly kind when they are done in silence. When the storm finally passed, the pressure lifted from Charles, and it lifted having made him, in the eyes of many, a better and more admired king than before. The speculation faded, as speculation always does once the truth appears. The rumors of chaos were forgotten, and in their place remained a quiet new understanding of the man on the throne, that beneath the crown and the ceremony was someone capable of a deep and stubborn loyalty, willing to suffer for the sake of a friend, and unwilling to buy his own comfort with another man's dignity. That was the truth the whole affair was built on. The world is quick to read silence as weakness, and quick to reward those who explain themselves loudest and defend their image hardest. But there is a kind of strength that never explains itself, that would rather be misunderstood than betray a trust, that carries a heavy secret in silence because someone it loves asked it to. Charles could have ended his own suffering with a single sentence. He chose instead to keep his word, and in choosing silence over comfort and loyalty over image, he showed a strength far greater than any statement could ever have proven. There is a lesson in it that reaches well beyond kings and palaces. Every person at some point is trusted with something fragile that belongs to someone else, a secret, a weakness, a moment of vulnerability shared in confidence, and every person is sometimes tempted to spend that trust for their own gain, to explain, to clear their name, to make themselves look better at another's expense. The measure of a person is what they do in exactly that moment. Charles was handed the perfect excuse to break a confidence, wrapped in genuine pressure and real consequences, and he refused it quietly, for weeks, because the trust was not his to spend. That refusal is a small and unglamorous kind of heroism, the kind that wins no medals and is usually never even seen. But it is heroism all the same, and the country recognized it the moment they understood it. It also said something about what the crown, at its best, is meant to be. The communications advisor had spoken of protecting the institution, as though the institution were a thing made of image and reputation. Charles understood it differently. To him, the institution was made of something older and deeper, of duty, of honor, of the bonds between the people who serve it and the people it serves. A crown that would betray a faithful old servant to save its own image would have nothing left worth crowning. By protecting one loyal man at cost to himself, Charles had not weakened the monarchy at all. He had reminded the whole country what it was actually for. Charles was under real pressure that season, and the speculation about the palace was fierce and unrelenting, and for a while it truly seemed to wound him. But the developments that fueled all that noise were never what the country imagined. There was no chaos, no power struggle, no king losing his grip. There was only an old man who wished to leave with his dignity whole, and a monarch who loved him enough to let the whole world think the worst, rather than break a quiet promise. In the end, the speculation said nothing true about Charles at all. But his silence said everything. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please do not forget to like and subscribe. And we will see you in the next one.